11 days ago, a man named Lindsey Graham, who'd spent 23 years in the Senate, died suddenly, hours after making one final promise to the president. Since that night, the Senate Majority Leader, a man famous for never committing to anything, has started saying things and doing things he flatly refused to do for an entire year. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what changed, why a bill that's been dead on arrival for 12 straight months suddenly has more momentum than ever, and why the next 8 legislative days in Washington could decide whether America requires proof of citizenship to vote before the midterms. On Saturday evening, July 11th, in Washington, D.C., Senator Lindsey Graham had just landed back from Ukraine, his 10th trip to the country, where he'd met with President Zelensky. The day before, he and a bipartisan group of senators had unveiled a Russia sanctions package with the White House, legislation he'd pushed for years. He was 71 years old and scheduled to appear on Meet the Press the next morning. Late that night, emergency responders were called to his Capitol Hill home for a report of chest pains. According to a report from the Wall Street Journal citing dispatch audio, crews had to force entry because the door was deadbolted and no one answered. Radio traffic from the scene referenced CPR being performed on someone in cardiac arrest. By early Sunday morning, Graham's office confirmed he had died, describing it as a brief and sudden illness. A preliminary report from the D.C. Medical Examiner's Office later attributed the death to an aortic dissection stemming from arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease, a tear in the body's main artery, sudden and largely unpredictable. Here's the detail that turned a personal tragedy into a political flashpoint. President Trump had spoken with Graham that very evening, hours before paramedics arrived. Trump later told NBC's Kristen Welker on Meet the Press that Graham had called him, mentioned he just landed from Ukraine, sounded tired but otherwise fine, and told him something specific. We're all set for the Save America Act. Trump called Graham's death a big blow to the legislation and separately posted that Graham was one of the greatest people and senators I have ever known, ordering flags lowered to half-staff. That single sentence, "we're all set," is what set off everything that followed. What did Graham mean by that? What did he actually know or believe in his final hours? Hold on to that question, because the answer, or at least the closest thing to one, comes later in this video, from Senate Majority Leader John Thune himself. To understand why that single phone call carries so much weight, you need to understand the position Graham held. He wasn't just another senator, he chaired the Senate Budget Committee. And in the modern Senate, that committee's chairman controls access to one of the most powerful legislative tools available, budget reconciliation. Reconciliation is a special fast-track process that allows certain budget-related legislation to pass the Senate with a simple majority, 51 votes, completely bypassing the 60-vote threshold required to overcome a filibuster. It's the same mechanism that's allowed major party line bills to pass in recent years when the votes for a bipartisan deal simply weren't there. Graham had already shepherded major reconciliation packages through the Senate as Budget Committee chairman. According to reporting from Fox News, he'd said just weeks before his death that Republicans were planning to make a down payment on the SAVE Act and reconciliation in the fall, and that he intended to meet with the White House to get that process moving. That's the machinery he controlled. That's what gave his final words to the president real weight. He wasn't expressing hope. He was actively working the mechanism that could make it happen. So what exactly is this legislation a man spent his final phone call on? The SAVE Act, formerly the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, requires documentary proof of citizenship in order to register to vote in federal elections, along with additional provisions related to voter identification. That's the core of it. It's President Trump's top legislative priority of the year. At a House Republican retreat, Trump reportedly told attendees that passing it would guarantee the midterms, arguing it's the single issue voters bring up most often. Senator Mike Lee, one of the bill's most vocal champions, has summarized the underlying argument simply. Republicans want it to be easy to vote and hard to cheat. Democrats have been equally direct in opposition, though their objection isn't to voter ID itself. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has argued the real issue is that the bill functions as a voter suppression measure, telling reporters that his objection isn't to a photo ID when you show up to vote, but to the risk that as many as 20 million or more eligible voters could show up and be told they're not on the rolls due to documentation issues. Schumer told CNN's Jake Tapper flatly, "We will not let it pass in the Senate. Not a request for changes, not an offer to negotiate, an outright commitment to block it." That opposition held for a full year. Here's the track record. In early June, 4 Senate Republicans voted down an amendment that would have tied the SAVE Act to the party's immigration enforcement funding package, meaning the bill didn't even fail because of Democratic opposition that time. It failed to hold together its own side. Republicans then attempted to push it through the reconciliation process anyway, and it fell well short of the votes needed. Because the bill's voting provisions were ruled non-compliant with the strict rules governing what reconciliation can actually include. Every path led to the same wall. And for most of that year, Senate Majority Leader John Thune stood at that wall and didn't move. To be fair to Thune, the record isn't one of simple obstruction. Back in March, he reportedly told reporters he was open to using reconciliation for the bill. But by June, he was invoking what's known as the Byrd Rule, warning on Fox Business that if the Senate parliamentarian strips the bill's language from a reconciliation package, it reverts to needing 60 votes rather than 51. His reasoning was procedural. Reconciliation provisions have to be primarily budgetary, not policy-driven, for the parliamentarian to allow them to stay in. That's not a man fighting for the bill. That's a man explaining calmly and repeatedly why the fight was likely unwinnable through this route. And to a lot of frustrated Republican voters. That kind of detached realism from the most powerful Republican in the Senate stung more than an outright refusal would have. It's worth taking a minute to actually explain the Byrd Rule, because once you understand it, the entire strategic picture becomes much clearer, and most coverage skips over this part entirely. The rule is named after longtime West Virginia Senator Robert Byrd, who served in the Senate for more than 50 years. Reconciliation itself emerged in the 1970s as a fast-track process for handling budget legislation. Byrd grew concerned that senators would start stuffing unrelated policy priorities into these filibuster-proof bills, using the budget process as a backdoor around normal Senate rules. So the Senate adopted a rule bearing his name. Any provision in a reconciliation bill that's extraneous to the budget, meaning its fiscal impact is merely incidental to its actual policy goal, can be challenged and stripped out by the Senate parliamentarian, an unelected procedural official whose ruling has repeatedly been the obstacle here. Under that standard, a citizenship requirement for voting looks, on its face, like policy, not budget. But there's context worth adding here too. Senate rules and precedents aren't as fixed as they're often described. In 2013, Senate Democrats under Harry Reid eliminated the filibuster for most presidential nominations. In 2017, Senate Republicans extended that same change to Supreme Court nominees, the exact mechanism that produced the current makeup of the court. The Senate has shown repeatedly that its own procedural rules bend when a majority wants something badly enough. So the real question was never really whether the Senate could find a way to do this. It's whether Thune wanted to badly enough to spend the political capital required. For a year, his answer, in practice, was no. Before getting to what changed with Thune, it's worth understanding the pressure that was already building on the House side, because that chamber had its own chaotic stretch leading up to Graham's death. By late June, conservative House Republicans had run out of patience with the Senate's delays. Members including Anna Paulina Luna, Chip Roy, Victoria Spartz, Thomas Massey, and Tim Burchett voted down a procedural rule effectively freezing House floor operations for a second consecutive week over the SAVE Act. 14 House Republicans voted to sink a procedural measure that would have attached the bill to a $1.15 trillion defense spending package. Speaker Mike Johnson had to send lawmakers home early ahead of a nearly 2-week holiday recess, visibly frustrated, telling reporters it made no sense for House Republicans to stall their own chamber's progress over Senate Democrats' refusal to act. Even President Trump reportedly appealed to the holdouts directly to stop the standoff, and they still didn't budge. That's a striking data point on its own. These House members were willing to defy the president himself and freeze their own party's legislative agenda rather than let this issue quietly die. That was the landscape. Heading into July 10th, a frozen House, a gridlocked Senate, and an immovable majority leader. Then came the night of July 11th. Grief has a way of moving institutions that ordinary pressure can't. Within a day of Graham's death, Thune publicly called him a trusted advisor and colleague, noting that presidents and world leaders had relied on his counsel. That kind of tribute is common after a colleague's death, and on its own, it's just words. What followed wasn't just words. On the Senate floor, Senator Mike Lee urged his colleagues to honor what he characterized as Graham's dying wish and pass the bill. And then, this week, the House broke its weeks-long deadlock. House Republicans passed a procedural rule by a vote of 215 to 211, a real win for Speaker Johnson, advancing a strategy to combine the SAVE Act with a fiscal year 2027 appropriations bill funding the Pentagon and national security programs. On Capitol Hill, this bundling approach has been dubbed Reconciliation 3.0 by House Republicans. Johnson reportedly won back Luna and Burchett, the same members who'd opposed this exact strategy before the July 4th recess, apparently because leadership had finally committed fully to the fight. The House also passed a procedural resolution directing that the SAVE Act be folded into the broader reconciliation package, the same mechanism Graham himself had been actively building toward before he died. That gives this push two separate tracks. One riding along with a must-pass national security funding bill, and one embedded directly in the filibuster-proof reconciliation process. With the House having done its part, all attention turned to one person, John Thune. This is where we get the closest thing to an answer about what Graham meant by "we're all set." In an interview published by the New York Post, Thune said Republicans may finally have found a workable path to pass the SAVE Act, and reflected directly on what Graham might have been telling Trump in that final call. Thune was careful to say he couldn't know for certain what his late friend had in mind. But then he said this, on the record, perhaps what Lindsey was talking to the president about, I don't know this for a fact, was whether or not there was an option for reconciliation. And there is a way in which I think you could do that. Read that again. There is a way. From the same man who spent the better part of a year explaining patiently and repeatedly why the Byrd rule made this nearly impossible. Some reporters covering the story have suggested this might partly be an effort to ease pressure within his own caucus, since Trump-aligned senators had been pushing him for months to unify Republicans behind the bill, even as he maintained the votes simply weren't there under normal Senate rules. That's a fair, sober read of the situation. Maybe it's caucus management. Maybe it's genuine grief. Maybe it's simply a majority leader recognizing that his colleague's final political act deserves more than a procedural shrug. Whatever the actual motivation, the words are now on the public record, and words like that from a sitting majority leader carry real weight. When Thune said there was no path, there was. Functionally, no path. Now he's saying there's a way. The people around Thune aren't letting this moment quietly fade either. Senators Mike Lee and Rick Scott are pushing to cancel the Senate's traditional August recess entirely until the bill is resolved. And House members, including Andy Ogles, have joined that push publicly. Lee has been pressing this point for weeks. In a video that President Trump himself reportedly shared, Lee asked why the Senate would take a recess right now at all, arguing lawmakers should stay and finish the work instead of leaving town for weeks. Lee has also floated reviving the traditional talking filibuster, forcing senators who want to block the bill to actually hold the floor and speak publicly for as long as they want to delay it, rather than blocking it procedurally without ever having to explain themselves on camera. Lee's argument is that modern filibusters have become far too easy to sustain quietly. His goal is to force Democrats to visibly defend their opposition to a citizenship requirement on live television for as long as they're willing to keep talking. It's worth noting Thune himself has separately told reporters that, as of earlier this year, the votes simply weren't there to force a talking filibuster scenario, either which shows just how contested even the tactical options remain within the GOP conference. Here's where the political and the personal collide directly. The midterms land on November 3rd. And because Graham's own Senate seat was already up for election this cycle, his successor will be chosen in that same election. The seat Lindsey Graham held for 23 years will be filled in the very first federal election held after his death, and the open question hanging over that election is whether it will be conducted under the exact reforms he spent his final phone call promising to help deliver. Meanwhile, once the House reconvened on July 13th, it had just 8 legislative days before leaving Washington again for a month-long August recess. 8 days to finish what's been stuck for a year. It's worth being honest about how far this actually is from finished. The Senate parliamentarian can still strike the bill's language from the reconciliation package, and if that happens. Thune himself has said it reverts right back to needing 60 votes, which Republicans don't currently have with unified Democratic opposition. Some individual Republicans may still waver on procedural grounds. Schumer has made clear he intends to use every tool available to block it. Senator Tommy Tuberville has publicly warned that Graham's death leaves a real procedural void. Since Graham wasn't just a supporter of the bill as Budget Committee chairman, he was the person actually structuring the reconciliation process Trump has been demanding Republicans use. Nobody serious is calling this a done deal. But here's what's genuinely different now, and what's worth watching over the coming weeks for the first time in this entire year-long saga. 3 things exist simultaneously. The House has actually passed a working mechanism. The president is treating this as his single top legislative priority. And the Senate Majority Leader has said on the record that there's a viable way forward. That specific combination has never existed at the same time before in this fight. It's worth stepping back even further, because the SAVE Act fight has actually been entangled with an even bigger argument all year, whether the Senate should change its own rules entirely. Earlier this year, President Trump posted on Truth Social that he wouldn't sign other legislation until the SAVE Act passed, calling it a priority that supersedes everything else and demanding it be done immediately, with the White House later clarifying he'd make an exception to keep the Department of Homeland Security funded. At the same time, Trump pushed Senate Republicans to eliminate the legislative filibuster altogether for this bill, warning that Democrats would do exactly that themselves the moment they regained power anyway. Thune, for his part, held firm against that specific idea for most of the year, telling reporters directly that the votes simply weren't there neither to eliminate the filibuster outright, nor to sustain a talking filibuster strategy that would require near unanimous Republican support to pull off. His exact words, as reported, the votes aren't there, one to nuke the filibuster, and the votes aren't there for a talking filibuster. It's just a reality. And I'm a person who has to deliver sometimes the not so good news that the math doesn't add up. But those are the facts. There's no getting around it. That's important context for understanding just how significant his more recent comments to the New York Post actually are. This wasn't a man who'd been quietly open to creative solutions all along and just needed the right moment to say so publicly. This was someone who spent months bluntly repeatedly telling his own party's base and the president himself that the math didn't work full stop. That's the baseline his post-Graham comments represent a real departure from. None of this pressure exists in a vacuum. A meaningful part of what's been driving this fight is grassroots frustration within the Republican base itself. According to Trump's own remarks at a House Republican retreat in Doral, Florida, he described voter enthusiasm around this issue in stark terms, saying that wherever he goes, this is essentially the only thing supporters want to talk about ahead of housing, ahead of other economic concerns, whether or not that's a precise reflection of broader public opinion. It reflects how central this bill has become to how the party's core supporters are measuring Republican follow through heading into the midterms. That's part of why the House holdouts Luna, Roy, Spartz, Massey, Burchett, and others were willing to freeze their own chamber's business rather than let this slide, even at the cost of defying the president's own request to stand down temporarily. It's also part of why Thune's year-long insistence on procedural realism was such a persistent source of friction with his own party's most energized wing, even though, on the merits of Senate procedure, he wasn't wrong about the obstacles. That tension between a base demanding results now and a majority leader insisting the rules don't bend just because people are frustrated is really the underlying story of this entire year. Right up until the night, everything shifted. Whatever you think of Lindsey Graham's politics, and plenty of conservatives disagreed with him plenty of times over the years, there's something undeniably weighty about a man spending what turned out to be the final hours of his life exhausted, fresh off a transatlantic flight from a war zone, telling the President of the United States that the work of securing federal elections was on track. Whatever happens over these 8 legislative days, whatever the parliamentarian ultimately rules, whatever deal does or doesn't get struck, that phone call happened. And John Thune knows it happened. Every single time he walks past his friend's now empty desk on the Senate floor. The question now is straightforward. Does the Senate treat this as unfinished business worth finishing? Or does it get set aside with condolences while everyone heads off to recess? We'll be tracking every twist over these next 8 days, the parliamentarians' rulings, the recess fight, whatever Thune says next, and breaking each one down the same way we did here, straight from the source.